The most amazing story. Lesson 23, The King's Dream. One night, long after Joseph told the butler and baker the meaning of their dreams, the king of Egypt had a dream. The Bible says, "Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine-looking and fat. Then 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and the ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows." Pharaoh dreamed a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them, and the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. Now it came to pass in the morning that Pharaoh was troubled, and he called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Genesis 41, 1-8. None of the magicians or wise men in all of Egypt could tell the king what his dream meant. Then the king's butler remembered Joseph. The Bible says, "Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, 'I remember when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night. Now there was a young man with us there, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. And just as he interpreted for us, so it happened.'" Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved, changed his clothes, and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it." So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." Genesis 41, 9-16. Joseph did not trust in his own wisdom. He trusted in God. Joseph knew that only God could tell him the meaning of Pharaoh's dream. Genesis 41, 25-32 says, "Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, 'The 7 good cows and the 7 good heads are 7 years, and the 7 thin and ugly cows and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten. The famine will be very severe.' And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass." Even though the Egyptians worshipped false gods, God cared about them. Now that Pharaoh knew what was going to happen, the Egyptians would be able to prepare for the coming food shortage. Joseph said to Pharaoh, "Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let him appoint officers over the land, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the 7 years of famine, that the land may not perish during the famine." Genesis 41, 33-36. God gave Joseph wisdom so he could tell Pharaoh what to do. Genesis 41, 37-43 says, "So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you.' And Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt.' Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, "Bow the knee!" So he set him over all the land of Egypt. This was a huge change for Joseph. In one afternoon, he went from being a prisoner in the king's dungeon to being governor over the entire land of Egypt. Who made this happen? God did. God is in charge of everything that happens in this world. God was working everything out according to his plan. The Bible says that Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain, as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." And Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. All countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. Genesis 41:46-57. For 7 years there was lots of food in Egypt. Joseph collected and stored as much grain as possible. Then in the 8th year, the time of hunger began. No food grew anywhere. So Pharaoh sent the hungry Egyptians to Joseph, and he sold them the grain he had collected during the good years. But the famine was not just in Egypt. Even in Canaan, where Joseph's family lived, people started running out of food. When Joseph's father heard there was grain in Egypt, he sent his sons to buy some. The Bible says this: when Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them. Genesis 42:1-9a. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt to buy food, they did not recognize Joseph. They did not guess that the Egyptian governor was their brother. They did not realize they were bowing to Joseph. But God knew all along that someday Joseph would be a great ruler. God knew all along that someday Joseph's brothers would bow down before him. Remember, God knows everything. He knew the meaning of Pharaoh's dreams. He knew about the coming food shortage and what Pharaoh should do to get ready. God knew that someday Joseph would be a great ruler in Egypt and that his brothers would bow down to him. There is nothing God does not know.